I want to begin tonight by acknowledging that this talk takes place when the situation in Ukraine is ongoing. And I just, usually I said to Ian over dinner, usually I visit the BBC website 2 times or 3 times a day and have done for 25 years. And now I visit about 3 times a minute, it seems like. I just don't want to pretend that it's not happening. And it's made me, as I'm sure many of us, think about many, many things. And one of the things it's made me think about is that the people that I'm going to talk about tonight, their lives were lived in the shadow of war. Their lives were lived in the shadow of the Napoleonic Wars. But Jane Austen and Maria Edgeworth and Sarah Siddons, all these people that I'm going to mention, lived their lives against that backdrop. And I'm somebody who believes that Austen's works show over and over again that she was alive and writing and thinking when wars were happening. And I'm deeply saddened that we joined her in that awareness. But I wanted to acknowledge it. So let me turn now to the topic at hand, which is the women of the Regency, a revolution almost beyond expression. I take that title from, does anybody know where that is from? Just shout it out. It's from Austen's Persuasion. And it's when just before Wentworth writes that letter. And if you're an admirer of Persuasion, that is for me, the most moving moment in all of Austen. And Anne, when he comes back in the room, Anne talks about a revolution almost beyond expression. So let me move through. It's come now. This is the heart-stopping moment. I give a PowerPoint presentation when I hit the button for it to advance, and it doesn't advance. Now it's got to wake up or something. Is that what it is? It's something. I'll tell you when you're sitting in Ontario and it doesn't do it, it's like a real jolt. Okay, so this talk is in 3 main parts. I like when I go to a talk to know where we're going. I can't stand it sitting there wondering how long is this going to go. It's in 3 parts. I'm going to talk about traditional accounts of the Regency, which are, of course, heavily dominated by men. I wanted to write a book that had lots of women in it as well. Then I'll talk about the women of the Regency, and then I'm going to talk about what my students will tell you I always want to talk about, which is Jane Austen. Now, I'm not talking about Jane Austen just because we're in Bath. I don't want you to think that I talk about Jane Austen when I'm in Ontario, Canada, and Alberta, Canada as well. So, traditional accounts. This is the Prince Regent, as we may know. This is somebody who admires the Prince Regent. This is a portrait by Thomas Lawrence, only, of course, it's not really a portrait because the Regent wanted to turn that into a coin. And you can see that the profile suggests that that's what he was after. Like many of the Regent's plans, that didn't quite come to fruition. But there's Lawrence's portrait. You can see from the bottom that he's not done. But maybe he had the head and that's all he wanted. So let me just remind you that the Regency began on the 5th of February, 1811, when the Prince of Wales replaced his violently insane father, George III, as the sovereign de facto, and ended on the 29th of January, so 202 years ago now, when George III died and the Prince Regent became King George IV. He was King George IV for 10 years, then William for 7 years, and then Victoria. And then we make it to the 20th century. I love this picture. I had to get it in. This is the Regent, or at least this is a caricature of the Regent clutching his beloved Brighton Pavilion. The Regent was widely despised at the time in his era, and very often, too often, oblivious in matters of state. But his love of prize fighting, his love of horse racing, and his love of the theater set the tone for a good deal of the entertainment in the age, as did his delight in consumerism. Now, lots of people in the Regency didn't have any money, but if you did, consumerism is something that I argue in the book took hold during the Regency. Gamblers bet wildly, like the Regent, on cards and dice. The Regent's vast consumption of food and drink empowered debauchees across the social spectrum. This is Cruikshank's portrait of the Regent after the massacre at Peterloo. And you can notice on his belt, or on his at his waist, there's a corkscrew attached. And I also think that his stare is a bit glassy-eyed. I think that's to suggest that he's been drinking as well, as he very often was, and as this picture demonstrates. The Regent's days and nights of committed libertinism inspired rakes, both female, and we think of rakes as male, but there were lots of female rakes in the Regency as well, who enjoyed an unabashed revelry of promiscuity and pornographic obsession across his 10 years as the Regent. Now, this is what happens when you get things that come on the screen. I can't read what I want to say. In his love of both elegance and excess, violence and restraint, learning and lasciviousness, the lowbrow and the high-minded, the Regent embodied many of the extremes that have come to define his regency, not only within court circles. One of the things that was interesting as I worked on the book was the ways in which the behavior of the royals sort of cascaded down the social hierarchies. So even people much further down the social ladder emulated the behavior of the Regency. Or of the Regent, excuse me. So, and I would say, despite his many excesses and despite his many failures, the Regent partially redeems himself with cultural, aesthetic, and literary judgments that have proven remarkably sound. Now, my students always say, well, because he liked Jane Austen, you'll forgive him almost anything. Okay, there's kind of a little bit of truth in that. He did recognize Austen long before she was, her appeal now is out of all proportion to what it was in her own day. And also the Regent, bought a picture by Constable. He bought he hired John Nash. He hired John Rennie. He hired many of the people whose work we admire now. So along with the Regent, in traditional accounts of the Regency, there are many other men. This is the Canadian in me putting up this man at the top. His name is Isaac Brock. He's born in Guernsey. And Brock is sent to Canada, and he is there and the leading Canadian figure when the War of 1812 breaks out. And in Canada, he is regarded as a national hero. He's killed in 1812. I live very, very close. In fact, I got my second jab in Brockville, Ontario, named after Isaac Brock. And on the bottom, this is one of the men involved in the Luddite riots, which, as you will know, broke out in 1811 and 1812 and 1813, and even on into 1816. Other men who made a mark, the Duke of Wellington, of course, defeated Napoleon on the fields of Waterloo in June 1815. It is for you to save the world again, Tsar Alexander had told Wellington after hearing the news that Napoleon had broken from Elba. And this is Wellington in 1812 after he's won the Battle of Salamanca. And I think Wellington looks a haunted man in that image. He has seen carnage on the battlefield for several years. And yes, I think he looks haunted there. This is Lord Byron, who was, of course, the most famous poet of the era. And I argue in the book, the first modern celebrity. Many people have made that argument before me. Byron set the stage for our ongoing fascination with personal notoriety, violent spectacle, creative genius, and celebrity culture. He became famous, he says very famously, 210 years ago this month, I awoke one morning and found myself famous after he publishes a poem called Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Now, when I think of that, I think, what if someone published a poem like that? What are the odds of someone publishing a poem today and waking up and finding him or herself famous? I worry that the odds of it are quite low. This is Walter Scott, who was the most famous novelist of the era, far, far, far more popular than Jane Austen. Here's how popular Walter Scott was. Mark Twain insisted that Scott's novel Waverley. Scott publishes Waverley in 1814, and then a series of novels which follow Red Gauntlet and Ivanhoe and Heart of Midlothian and a series of others, which collectively are known as the Waverley novels. If you go to Edinburgh now into a second-hand bookshop, you can see the shop groaning under the weight of the editions of Walter Scott's Waverley novels. And it's because he's so immensely popular that every shop's got 16 different versions of the Waverley novels. Mark Twain insisted that Scott's Waverley novels, quote, had so large a hand in making the Southern character as it existed before the American Civil War, that he is in a great measure responsible for the war. So sometimes my students think, well, what difference does literature make? It doesn't make any difference at all. And then I read a quotation like that and I think, well, literature can have an immense impact. It doesn't mean it's a good impact. I don't think forming the Southern character in a way that leads to war is a good impact. But can it have an impact? Yes, of course it can. Literature changes our lives all the time, I would suggest. Edmund Keene was the most famous actor of the era. I love this picture of Keene. Other actors projected control. Keene projected danger. His predecessors and rivals played their roles with discipline. Keene, as you can see in this image, played his on the edge of irrationality. This is George Beau Brummell, who was the foremost dandy of the Regency. Sometimes you see representations of Brummell and he's dressed up like a peacock. That's not what George Brummell did. Brummell prized cleanliness, meticulous simplicity, and buttoned-up stylishness. Brummell said very famously, if someone turns to look at you in the street, you're not stylish. You want to be precise and meticulous, not flamboyant. When Lord Byron ranked the three great men of the 19th century, he placed himself third, Napoleon second, and Brummell first. That's astonishing. I still think that's astonishing. Every time I read that quotation, I think it's astonishing. With the invention of the miner's safety lamp, this is Sir Humphrey Davy. He was knighted by the Regent. Remember I said he had some redeeming qualities. He recognized the last scientist to be knighted was Sir Isaac Newton. A century went by and no scientists were knighted. And then the Regent knighted Sir Humphrey Davy. And on the bottom, it's Michael Faraday, who, of course, worked in Davy's lab in the Regency. And in inventing the miner's safety lamp, Britain has got to rise to great eminence in the Industrial Revolution. That's powered by coal. You can't have all these people dying in the mines. You need something down there that illuminates it without being, without being an explosive device. And Davy and Faraday figure out how to do it. And so they were among the first to demonstrate the powers of science to improve the human condition. This is Charles Babbage. There are a number of different versions of when Babbage first devised a calculating machine. He never built it, of course. It's just all in his head. But it's widely viewed as the forerunner of the modern computer. And in his autobiography, Babbage himself dates it 1812 or 1813. So if you're me, you go Sense and Sensibility is 1811, Pride and Prejudice is 1813. I wanted to write a book in which that image of that's when someone finally built it, that calculating machine and Pride and Prejudice cohabit in your imagination. I want to dislodge this image of Austen as this sort of rarefied, domesticated, pretty houses and dresses and teacups. Not that it isn't there, it's just that's not always there. So Babbage is devising his calculating machine. This is Constable, who produced dozens of timeless versions of rural England. He exhibited the White Horse, the first of his 6-footers, in the spring of 1819. The hay wain is the next year. I couldn't get it in. It was a very sad day when I realized I couldn't get Constable's hay wain in because it wasn't in the Regency. This is Jmw Turner, who revolutionized British landscape art. He exhibited Snowstorm, Hannibal, and his army crossing the Alps in 1812. And of course, when we see this image, we can see the vast vortex and the sun blotted out. And then the human beings are in the final, maybe fifth of the picture at the bottom. And this is Turner showing the futility of those armies and the vastness of the natural world and the power of the natural world. And he's writing about Hannibal, but there are many, many people who will tell you he's actually writing about Napoleon. It's just that it's a little bit safer and a little bit less direct to talk about Hannibal crossing the Alps. John Clare is our first ecological poet because of his deep comprehension of the human and the non-human worlds and of the intricate interdependence of the two. In 1820, he published a volume called Poems Descriptive of Rural Life and Scenery. And in this volume, his achievement, I think, is not simply to write of woods and birds and meadows, which he does, in economic or even aesthetic terms, but to view them as participants in a broader community of living things. Now, we recognize that kind of language now, but when Clare did it 202 years ago, people did not see it through an ecological lens in the way that I hope we do now. So traditional accounts of the Regency feature men like that. And when I give a talk like this, I'm not out to diminish the accomplishments of the men. I'm glad that Wellington defeated Napoleon. I'm glad that Turner painted. I'm glad that Constable painted. But there are women at the same time, and in accounts of the Regency, they have been pushed to one side, with maybe the exception of Austen. People know? Anybody know who this is? Off the top? No, that's a good guess. So it's Lady Caroline Lamb. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, so I'll come back to Lady Caroline. So this is me producing this little gallery. Many Regency women lived in brutal circumstances. Others were princesses. Some traveled far beyond Britain. Others worked tirelessly to reform Britain. Some worked as courtesans. Many pursued sexual pleasures with men or with other women. Some worked as artists. Others were actors or writers. So the woman at the top here is Maria Bicknell, who is the love of John Constable's life, and they marry in 1816. Lady Salisbury is one of the great, she loves to hunt, you can see from this image. She's one of the great sportswomen of the Regency. Frances Palmer marries Jane Austen's youngest brother, Charles. They get married in Bermuda in 1807, and I have to tell you, their daughter Cassandra is christened in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So it's me slipping in another Canadian reference for you. Mary Lamb, this is Charles Lamb, the SS Charles Lamb. She's also a writer, and she and Lamb lived together throughout the Regency. Mary Linwood is an artist in needlepoint. So she produces needlepoint representations of great works of historical art, and they're amazing, the different roles and the technique. She has a gallery in Leicester Square in 1815. Julia Johnson is one of the most famous courtesans of the Regency, and Julia Peel married Robert and went on to become the Prime Minister's wife. And she is a really interesting figure, and the relationship between Julia Peel and Robert Peel is also, I think, very interesting. So let me move to more other women. Britain abolished the slave trade, as we all know, in 1807, but during the Regency, slavery itself was still legal across the British Empire. So we get rid of the slave trade in 1807, but it's 1833 before we get rid of slavery. So, you know, we make a little progress, we don't really get there. And of course, when I say that, it's not like slavery today isn't something that's going on all the time. So when we talk about it being abolished, we're talking about it only in one historical sense, unfortunately. So Mary Prince was born in Bermuda in 1788. She was 10 years old when she was sold into slavery, and for the next several years, she passed from one sadistic master to another sadistic master. Prince left a vivid and a horrifying account of the suffering she endured in Antigua, and then when she came to Britain in London. This is a quotation from her autobiography. Mrs. Wood told me if I did not mind what I was about, she would get my master to strip me and give me 50 lashes. You have been used to the whip, she said, and you shall have it here. This is in London. I was also sent by Mrs. Wood to be put in the cage one night and was next morning flogged by the magistrate's order at her desire. And all this for a quarrel I had about a pig with another slave woman. I was flogged on my naked back on this occasion. And the history of Mary Prince goes on in that vein for a good while. The history of Mary Prince was published in 1831, but she writes about her life at different points during the Regency. Prince wrote the first narrative by and about a Black woman to be published in Britain. 2 years after its controversial appearance in 1831, Britain finally did abolish slavery. It is not known what became of Mary Prince. After 1833, she disappears tellingly from the historical record, but she gives voice to the barbarity of slavery in the Regency period. The man that says slaves be quite happy in slavery, that they don't want to be free, that man is either ignorant or a lying person. I never heard a slave say so. That's from The History of Mary Prince, a West Indian slave related by herself. At the opposite end of the social spectrum, Princess Charlotte was the most popular member of the royal family during the Regency. Her dad was very unpopular, and her mum was in exile, so she didn't have a whole lot of competition. However, she was married to Prince Leopold in May 1816, and that consolidated her place as a darling of the public. And it also sort of made people hope for a better, brighter future for the British monarchy. And then, as you will know, 18 months later, she died in childbirth. And there was an immense public outpouring of grief, an outpouring of grief that I don't think was seen again until Diana's death in August 1997. And when you read accounts of the princess and her death, and of course we can all remember what happened when Diana died, there are astonishing congruencies between those two events. Several other Regency women, a slave, a princess, several other Regency women left Britain. Wellington spent a lot of the Regency outside of Britain on the battlefield. Byron left in 1816 and never came back. Percy and Mary Shelley spent a lot of time on the continent. Princess Caroline, the Princess Regent, left in 1814. In other words, Regency Britain, the figures that we associate with it, a lot of them didn't always want to stay in Britain. Several Regency women left Britain in pursuit of adventure and novelty. Lady Hester Stanhope was one of them. With her rich and much younger lover, Michael Bruce, she traveled in great style to Turkey and Egypt and Lebanon. Most daringly, in 1813, the year of Pride and Prejudice, I can't help myself from saying, she became the first. Okay, I'll stop that. It's got to be irritating. It's interesting to me. It's got to be irritating for you. Well, in 1813, Jane Austen published Pride and Prejudice. There. Every time I say it, it'll go off in your head. Most daringly, in 1813, she became the first European woman to reach Palmyra in Syria, where she was proclaimed Queen of the Desert, and where she spent several days exploring the ancient ruins. The author and illustrator Maria Graham traveled for 2 years in Southeast India. She took a keen interest in the country's history, languages, literature, music, mythology, and religion. And every time I read something like that, this highly intelligent, curious person, not man or woman, took an interest in the country's language, literature, music, mythology, and religion, I think, oh, well, they must be sympathetic toward the people in that country. And what you discover many times is that Maria and others were also committed imperialists. So they were fascinated by the language, but they thought that India would be way better off if the Britons were there. Wasn't it wonderful that they had arrived? She made clear in her journal of her residence in India and letters on India that she was a committed imperialist. She urged her fellow Britons in India and at home to continue to conduct the innovations necessary for our own security. So I won't even leave, I'll leave it to your imagination what innovations were necessary. We're doing this for the permanent improvement of the Indians. So you can hear this colonial mission in her voice. Lady Maria Nugent spent 3 years in India with her husband. Heartbroken having to leave her 4 young children behind in England, she spent much of her time battling loneliness, extreme heat, and poor health. And you can, of course, read accounts of her husband's experience, but I really wanted to write a book on which we got women's experience of it, women's experience of missing children or dealing with the heat or having to spend all that time by themselves because their husband was off, you know, whatever husbands do, hunting or whatever he was doing. Nugent, like Maria Graham, wrote insightfully on Anglo-Indian relations, deplored the lack of Christian reverence in her fellow colonists, and praised Hindus for real feelings of religion. But through it all, she retained, like Graham, her overweening confidence in the benefits bestowed by British rule. Elizabeth Fry is another Regency woman, and I think one of its most remarkable. She stayed in Britain and was one of the foremost reformers of the period. Fry's commitment was to the female prison population. In February 1813, she stepped for the first time into Newgate Prison in London and asked to see the female prisoners. This is, for me, one of the most remarkable moments in the Regency. She's walking by Newgate and she decides, with, I think, tremendous courage, that she's going to go in and see how other women live in the Regency. And of course, she is horrified. Nothing prepared her for what she saw. And this is what she wrote: the filth, the closeness of the rooms, the ferocious manners and expressions of the women toward each other, and the abandoned wickedness which everything bespoke are quite indescribable. Fry decided that she was going to do something to improve the situation. And by 1820, she had reformed Newgate in ways that I think genuinely did improve the lives of the women and children in there. And her reforms were introduced in prisons both across Britain and across Europe. In 1813, she wrote to her children, "I hope you will endeavor to be very useful and not spend all your time in pleasing yourselves," she wrote to her children after her first experience. "Remember, the way to be happy is to do good." The number of women and young girls involved in prostitution is one of the least appealing sides, in fact, not completely unappealing sides of the Regency. Nothing reveals the vicious and competitive side of the Regency like its thriving trade in prostitution. Of the 50,000 females working in London as prostitutes, Thomas Henry Kitchener conjectured in 1812 that about 2,000 of them were well-educated, and 3,000 came from the class composed of persons above the rank of menial servant. A further 20,000 probably worked as servants at some point and now lived wholly by prostitution. And then the final 25,000 lived partly by prostitution, laboring during the day as servants and shop girls before going out in the evening in search of custom in the city's taverns, darkened lanes, and crowded pleasure grounds. Regency brothels housed thousands of sex workers. Others lived with their families. This is a man named Pierce Egan who wrote, "Prostitution is so profitable a business and conducted so openly that hundreds of persons keep houses of ill fame for the reception of girls not more than 12 and 13 years of age." And those italics are not mine. Those italics are Pierce Egan's. He uses italics more freely than any other writer in the language, I think. But nevertheless, his account of the Regency sex trade is very disheartening, sad. Not all the prostitutes were young, and not all the prostitutes were on streets. Harriet Wilson worked almost exclusively in aristocratic circles, where she was well beyond the reach of jobbing madams, and where she enjoyed a great deal of social, sexual, and financial independence. Virginia Woolf writes a brilliant, everything Virginia Woolf writes is brilliant, but she writes a brilliant essay on Harriet Wilson. And you wouldn't think, what's Virginia Woolf doing writing about Harriet? But what she says about Harriet Wilson, you write 4 books, you couldn't get as close to what's happening as Woolf gets in this short essay. Harriet Wilson and others who worked in aristocratic circles sold not just sex, but relationships of amusement and ease, and even emotional intimacy. Her role as mistress was elaborately bound up in courtly notions of loyalty, discretion, and wit, and beauty, and style. Like many Regency women, I had to include this, Wilson had intense sexual fantasies about Byron. And this is what, and it's not clear whether they met. Byron said, "What are you talking about? We never met." But if you read her account of her life, her autobiography, they were bumping into each other all the time. When she wrote to Byron, as Claire Claremont did, she said, "I think of you as a man." Again, these are her italics. "I think of you as a man, brilliant, capricious, voluptuous, mad, ill-tempered, and delicious. For a moment a poet, the next a devil, the next a god. Exclamation mark, exclamation mark." Right. So people were having sex in the Regency, and people were having sexual fantasies in the Regency, and women were doing that. The cult of chastity and the terrible, intense pressure on women didn't prevent them, like Lydia Bennet and Pride and Prejudice, from having sexual fantasies, as you would expect. Wilson was also delighted to inform the world that Wellington was rubbish in bed. Now, you'll know that she published her memoirs and she tried to blackmail everybody, including the Regent, And she came to Wellington, and Wellington said, you know what he said? Publish and be damned, right? The Duke of Wellington, right? So she said, right, I will. And she says in this account, Wellington possessed no merit for home service or ladies' uses. And if you read Regency Code, that means he was rubbish in bed, was how she tactfully put it. Women made up the vast majority of sex workers in Regency Britain, but men were involved in the trade as well. One report claims that a woman named Mary Wilson ran a London brothel, catering solely for women of rank and fortune. In shape, the brothel was like a most elegant temple, and at its center were large saloons entirely surrounded with boudoirs, where a client stood behind darkened windows and viewed the inmates. So it wasn't just women who were being objectified. There were some women, according to this account, who objectified the inmates. So in one room, they will see fine, elegantly dressed young men playing at cards and music. So you've got to see these Regency aristocratic women with their noses up against this glass looking at these young Regency men. In another room, they'll see athletic men wrestling or bathing in a state of perfect nudity. In short, they will see such a variety of the animal that they cannot fail of suiting their inclinations. So once a woman decided on the man she wished to bed, she simply pointed him out to the chambermaid, and he was immediately brought to her. She can enjoy him in the dark or have a light and keep on her mask. She can stay an hour or a night and have one or a dozen men as she pleases. So that's not what you read in a Jane Austen novel, but that's not to say that women weren't having fantasies and having pursuing sexual pleasure. The hunger for sex and the reckless abandon maybe, with which so many pursued it generated a flourishing trade in pornography. The images, one painted by Thomas Rowlandson, who produced lots of other images, but lots of pornography as well. And the biggest collector of this that we know of was the Prince Regent. And as you might expect, and if you go to Windsor, it's in a big, big drawer called something like Entertainments or something like that. At the upper end of the market, wealthy smut connoisseurs with private collections, like the Prince Regent, produced expensive books containing colored copper plate engravings with images as indecent and obscene as can possibly be imagined, as one observer put it in 1812. But cheaper knockoff versions of these images were also widely available. The Regency was the last great brazen huzzah. I stole that word huzzah from my friend John, who put it in an email, and I thought, oh my God, that's fantastic. The last great brazen huzzah for rakes before the sobering and more strict mores of the Victorian age took at least some of the wind out of their sails. And these are more images from Rowlandson's erotica. Princess Regent Caroline had a sex life that rivaled her husband's in its excess and its variety. So the royals were behaving with abandon during the Regency. Declared their daughter Princess Charlotte. My mother was wicked, but she would not have turned so wicked had my father been much more wicked still. So they did. So the Princess Regent and the Prince Regent sort of tried to outdo one another in terms of bad behavior and sexual licentiousness. Lady Melbourne's son, the future Prime Minister, described his mother. This is Lord Melbourne, of course, became Prime Minister in the 1830s. Lady Melbourne was described by him, her son, as a remarkable woman, a devoted mother, an excellent wife, but not chaste. Not chaste. And he repeats it. That's not me making a mistake, but not chaste, not chaste. Lady Caroline Lamb was perhaps the most infamous woman with Princess Regent Caroline of the Regency. Byron met her in the spring of 1812, as we know, and he thought her the cleverest, most agreeable, absurd, amiable, perplexing, dangerous, fascinating little being that lives. She called him, as I've said, mad, bad, dangerous to know, and I am one of many critics who has said that description applies equally well to Lady Caroline herself. Within months, however, Byron's interest in her, by the autumn of 1812, his interest in her is waning. Byron thought she was a little too wild. Byron thought, let me repeat, Byron thought she was too wild. So that means, by any measure, she was pretty wild. Her near complete disregard of social convention alarmed him, as did the intensity of her sex drive. This is Lady Caroline to Lord Byron. You thought of others even while with me. Of that I am sure, she told him candidly. And the remembrance of that night and your accusation of wildness are disagreeable to me. This is Lady Caroline dressed up as a page boy to get into Byron's room. Further down the social hierarchy, Claremont also pursued Byron, and with equally disastrous results. So she's 17 years old. She's locked in this triangle with Percy Shelley and her stepsister, Mary Godwin at the time. And Mary's sort of pushing her out, and she says, well, if I can't have Percy Shelley the poet, I'll have Lord Byron the poet. So she writes him just out of the blue, 1 week before her 18th birthday. And she says, an utter stranger takes the liberty of addressing you. She wrote to him. Byron responded, as you might expect. The two agreed to meet, and Claremont had sex with him, we know, on the 20th of April, 1816, 5 days before Byron left England for good, creditors pounding at the door, and exactly 1 week before Claire had her 18th birthday. This is the child, Allegra, that was born Byron was gone. Byron and Claire thought Allegra was born 9 months later. Do we know where she was born? Here in Beau, yeah. Well, yeah, here. Byron was utterly indifferent. Of Claire, he shrugged, I never loved nor pretended to love her, but a man is a man. And if a girl of 18 comes prancing to you at all hours, there is but one way. Well, okay. Of Allegra, he asked with a sneer, is the brat mine? And of course, Allegra's life was just 5 years long and caused Claire a tremendous amount of heartache. Byron slept with hundreds of women, but his deepest attraction, as we know, was to men and to young men. Byron slept with well over 500 women, but his deepest attraction was to men. He has a bottomless sexual appetite. The Regency marks a crucial moment in British history when writers began a serious examination of the experiences and identities and sensibilities of homosexuality. And the most important figure here, for me, is Anne Lister, who has frequently been described or referred to as the first modern lesbian. At 15, she began a private diary that she wrote partly in code and that she used to record her many same-sex adventures. Mary Balcom was the great passion of Lister's life. The two met in 1812, and within months they were lovers. When in 1816, Mary wed a landowner named Charles Lawton, a severely shaken Lister refused to give up on their relationship. Mary, there is a nameless tie in that soft intercourse which blends us into one and makes me feel that you are mine. But Lister herself was far too hot-blooded to wait contentedly for Mary's letters or for Mary's occasional visits. So she feels very committed to Mary Balcom, but she's not really very good at sort of hanging around and waiting for her to show up. Lister had powerful sexual fantasies, and she took often a rakish delight in seduction. So in one of her entries from the Regency, she writes, foolish fancying about Caroline Greenwood, meeting her on Skirtcote Moor, taking her into a shed there and being connected with her, supposing myself in men's clothes and having a penis. To Mary Balcom's concern that their lesbianism was, quote, unnatural, this is astonishing. This is more than 200 years ago. Lister replied, my conduct and feelings are surely natural to me, inasmuch as they were not taught, not fictitious, but instinctive. Throughout her diaries, Lister writes with sophistication and largely without guilt, as she creates and then embraces her own lesbian identity. In 1820, just in the final days of the Regency, she writes, I know how to please girls. Sarah Siddons is one of the great figures in British theatrical history, and of course, someone like many of the other people I mentioned who have a close connection to Bath. On the evening of 29 July 1812, the 56-year-old Siddons bid an emotional farewell to the stage in a performance of Lady Macbeth, her most famous role. And when she left the stage at the end of the sleepwalking scene, the last time we see Lady Macbeth, the audience was so affected that they stood up and clapped and clapped and clapped, and they just called the play off. She left, and then we didn't see Macbeth and the Dunsinane, and it just ended. And then she came out, gave an 8-minute talk, and then retired. But she was one of those people who retired but didn't really retire. She came back to do several performances, and it was 1819 before she finally left the stage for good. The young Irish actress or actor Eliza O'Neal rose to prominence soon after Siddons retired. After years of success in the theatres of Belfast and Dublin, she made her London debut at Covent Garden in 1814 in the role of Juliet. Austen sees her in 1814 at Covent Garden. One critic, William Hazlitt, distinguished tellingly between Siddons and O'Neal. Whereas Siddons combines passion with lofty imagination and commanding intellect, O'Neal owes everything to extreme sensibility. That is, Regency actresses, I never know whether to say actresses or actors. My students get upset with me both ways. So difficult, but they had a prominent role in the theater, in the interpretation of Shakespeare, in the way that people regarded entertainment. And in Siddons' case, especially, were hugely talented. Dorothy Jordan was the reigning queen of British comedy. In her professional life, she was widely celebrated for her spontaneity. It's a beautiful picture of her charm, timing, and her beautiful voice. But she is best known now, I think, unfortunately, as the notorious longtime mistress of the Duke of Clarence, who later, of course, became King William IV. And he unceremoniously dumped her. And she carried on acting, but she went to France in 1816 and died there. Jordan was especially admired for Rosalind and As You Like It and Viola in Twelfth Night. She worked in the major London theatres, and like many of her fellow Regency performers, she supplemented her income with lucrative but exhausting tours in the provinces. In 1815, she went into exile in France. Napoleon's defeated. France opens back up, and she died there the following year. She is, there are many critics like Leigh Hunt and William Hazlitt and Charles Lamb who celebrate the comic genius of Dorothy Jordan. Of all the women novelists of the Romantic period, Maria Edgeworth was the most popular. Well established by the advent of the Regency as an educationalist and an author of children's stories, she consolidated her reputation as a novelist with The Absentee, Patronage, and Ormond, 1812, 1814, and 1817. She far outsells Austen in the Regency. A pervasive commitment to pedagogy meant that Edgeworth was determined to use fiction as a means of moral instruction, which is a fairly fatal thing to commit yourself to in fiction, I think, with the result that didacticism often burdens her plots and her characterizations, though at the time, Regency critics celebrated her for using fiction in that way. At the time when the standard print run for a novel was 1,000 copies, Edgeworth's Patronage sold 8,000 copies reportedly on the first day of publication alone. That gives you an idea of her popularity in the opening years of the Regency. And finally, before Austen, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is, I think, the most famous novel of the Regency. I've taught British Romanticism for almost 30 years. I don't think I've ever gone a year without teaching Frankenstein. If I never mark another essay on Frankenstein, I think I'll be okay. But as a book, that book just endlessly refreshes itself. It's just always, to me, interesting. It is more than any other work in English literature, I think, a prophecy about the modern world, in addition to launching the entirely new genre of science fiction. It has had, I think, an incalculable impact on how we think about, how we imagine science. Frankenstein reveals that scientific research has the potential to improve our lives in countless ways, but that if we deny or ignore our responsibilities, new discoveries have also the potential to pass dangerously far beyond the control of their makers and to assume hideous and unpredictable forms that may betray or may even destroy us. This is the Villa Diodati in Switzerland, where Frankenstein and Polidori started the vampire. As Victor's creature resembles him, so we resemble Victor in our faith in science, our exploitation of the earth, and our failure to take care of one another. My form, says the creature to his creator, is a filthy type of yours. So let me turn now to the third and final section, which is on Jane Austen. It is a truth universally acknowledged that Jane Austen chose to ignore the decisive historical events of her time. Where are the Napoleonic Wars? Where is the real current of history? That's Raymond Williams in, I think, an absolutely brilliant book called The Country and the City. But I don't think that particular quotation has worn very well or does justice to Williams. When I was writing the book, you know, when you're writing a book, you're working on something, there's sort of a moment when you go, oh, hang on a minute, maybe there is something here. And I was reading Mansfield Park, and I got to this sentence: a strange business this in America, Dr. Grant. What is your opinion? Now, the number of times I've read a Jane Austen novel and then read it again and gone, how on earth did I miss that? How did I miss that? This is one of those moments when I'm, bloody hell, that has got to be Austen talking about the War of 1812. How can that be the War of 1812? Austen referring to the War of 1812. And if you're Canadian, you know, that war had quite a bit to do with the shaping of the country that we know today, and the shaping of America as well. Austen refers to the War of 1812 or to the series of events leading up to it, depending on the internal dating of Mansfield Park. And when I thought, this is Jane Austen talking about the War of 1812, I want Dorothy Wordsworth talking about the Battle of Waterloo. And then you can start to see the ways in which women can have a more central role in the narrative and deserve a more central role, of course. This is V.S. Pritchett, who says, I think of Austen as a war novelist, formed very much by the Napoleonic Wars, knowing directly of prize money, the shortage of men, and the economic crisis and change in the value of capital. And Pritchett added that Austen was a novelist aware of the horror outside. And I find Pritchett's reading very convincing. Nina Auerbach, a very fine critic, says something similar when she says, in presenting these drawing rooms full of women watching the door and watching each other, Jane Austen tells us what an observant, genteel woman has to tell about the Napoleonic Wars. She writes novels about waiting. Now, next time you read a Jane Austen novel, just pay attention to the number of times that the women have to sit and wait. Over and over and over again. They wait. Life has to come to them. Darcy's got to come back. Is Willoughby going to come? Is Edward Ferrars going to show up? Or what? The number of times that women cannot. That's why when you read about Lady Hester Stanhope saying, oh, to hell with it, I'm going to Syria, you get very excited because she was able, from her financial position and her clout, to be able to do something like that. So Elizabeth Bennet is one of the most remarkable women in Austen, also one of the most remarkable women in the history of the world. And nowhere is that more obvious, I think, than in her heated exchange with Lady Catherine in Pride and Prejudice. This is what Elizabeth says to Lady Catherine: in marrying your nephew, I should not consider myself as quitting that sphere. He is a gentleman, I am a gentleman's daughter. So far, we are equal. And when I read Austen, or at least the lens through which I try to see Austen, that word equal explodes off the page. She's just denying what Lady Catherine wants her to accept. And the best critic on this that I have found is the late 19th century American critic, William Dean Howells. And he writes, it is impossible, do you play that conversation with Elizabeth and Lady Catherine through your head, it is impossible not to feel that Elizabeth's triumph over Lady Catherine is something more than personal. It is a protest. It is an insurrection. Now, when I call the talk a revolution beyond expression, that's what I'm talking about. That's what Howells says happens when Elizabeth stands up to Lady Catherine and says, I'm just not having it. I'm not having it. He's a gentleman, I'm a gentleman's daughter. So far, we're equal. And Lady Catherine is apoplectic, but that's too freaking bad, right? It's just too bad. It's a protest. It's an insurrection. When I read Austen, I hear protest and I hear insurrection. When I look at the title of, I used to say her first written novel was called Northanger Abbey. And then I realized it wasn't Northanger, it was North Anger, that she put anger right in the title of that book. And I think she wants us to say North Anger Abbey. All right, now I'm way off topic. That's what I think. Ultimately, of course, in Pride and Prejudice and back to Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth marries Darcy and becomes part of the privileged clique that she had previously deplored. But in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth also, for me, this is right out of the book, because I like this sentence and it took me a long time to write, but in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth also ushers in the modern world, for she believes in meritocracy over aristocracy, individual preference over dynastic alliance, and female desire over male presumption. Elizabeth is Darcy's future and ours. Lots of sentences I don't like when I read them again. I still like that one. Anne Elliot is another remarkable Austen woman, and perhaps especially when she and Captain Harville discuss the constancy of men and women toward the end of Persuasion, which is set in the White Hart Hotel in Bath. I know I'm supposed to say Bath, but I'm struggling. So this is what she says. This is, of course, the image on the top is the Cobb and Lime Regis, where I've only been once, and it was very windy, but I climbed up on the top. The person I was with was a little bit worried, but I thought I've got to be on the top. And we know when Tennyson went to Lyme Regis and said, we want to show you this, we want to show you this, and Tennyson said, I don't want to see any of that. Take me to the spot where Louisa Musgrove fell, which is right here. So this is what Anne says to Harville. We certainly do not forget you as soon as you forget us, she tells Harville, as 8 long years of pent-up anguish over Wentworth flood out of her. It is perhaps our fate rather than our merit. We cannot help ourselves. We live at home, quiet, confined, and our feelings prey upon us. Wentworth sitting nearby and Wentworth sitting nearby and writing a letter overhears this conversation, and he knows immediately that Anne is revealing her deepest feelings of alienation from and commitment to him. You pierced my soul, I am half in agony, half hope. That's part of his letter, and for me, the most moving moment in all of Austen. Finally, I want to turn to Miss Lamb in Austen's unfinished novel Sanditon from 1817. Miss Lamb, as we know, does not say a word, but she is, I think, among the most thought-provoking of the women in Austen. She is a young West Indian of large fortune in delicate health. And this is what Austen writes. Miss Lamb was beyond comparison the most important and precious, as she paid in proportion to her fortune. She was about 17, half mulatto, chilly and tender. Just try to process that. About 17, half mulatto, chilly and tender. Had a maid of her own and was to have the best room in the lodgings, and was always of the first consequence in every plan of Mrs. Griffiths. Mrs. Griffiths has 3 young ladies in her charge, 2 white young ladies and a black young lady. This is Margaret Drabble, who's a very, very fine English critic, and she is writing on Sanditon, and she writes as follows. She produces an edition, and she writes, I cannot help but comment on the extraordinary effect of the phrase half mulatto, half mulatto, chilly, and tender. It is as though one had entered into another world. That sense of Drabble's astonishment that a half mulatto walks into the world of Jane Austen. Who would ever have thought that Miss Lamb would prove to be half mulatto? And yet Jane Austen states the fact with the utmost calm. So we have this extraordinary moment where the author is calm, and the critic is going, how can this be? How can a half mulatto walk into the world of Jane Austen? Now, there have been many people who've sort of answered Drabble, and I think the finest is a woman named Sarah Siddons, who responds, unlike Drabble, no one in the novel expresses surprise or shock at Miss Lamb's arrival. Lady Denham immediately, this is the thing that's really telling for me, Lady Denham immediately begins to think of Miss Lamb as a potential wife for her nephew. So Margaret Drabble and other critics have gone, well, how could she? Whereas the person in the novel, who surely gets priority, thinks maybe she could marry. She's got money, and my nephew is not up to very much, etc. Sully adds, far from the Caribbean representing another world to the sheltered English writer. Part of my point is that Austen isn't sheltered, that we've constructed Austen as sheltered, but she isn't sheltered. the English writer repeated contacts brought these two putatively distant regions, England and the Caribbean, into close proximity, close ideological and economic proximity. And if you're me, you see Austen anticipating Bridgerton by 200 years. Austen normalizes Miss Loung's position within the English society that she is satirizing, and in doing so, writes Victoria Beau, Austen writes back against the tendency to fetishize cultural difference and opens up a side of critique against racial prejudice, as in fact I think Bridgerton did last year and will soon do again. I wanted to write a book that brought into view the many women whose lives and works played a decisive role in shaping the Regency, including Mary Prince, Elizabeth Fry, Lady Caroline Lamb, Anne Lister, Sarah Siddons, Lady Hester Stanhope, Mary Shelley, and Jane Austen, to name only a few. Taken together, these women, in my reading, transformed our understanding of performance, self-representation, slavery, love, gender politics, creativity, sexuality, empire, and much else. They produced, in my view, a revolution almost beyond expression. The images in this presentation came from Wikipedia and the National Portrait Gallery and my books. That's not my collection, I wish it was. Thank you very, very much. Just checking the time.
You kept the time. You started a little late, so thank you so much, Rob. I was trying to think of metaphors as we were whizzing through biographical digest of great and fascinating and interesting biographies. It felt perhaps a bit like I feel like we were in a sort of soiree with Professor Morrison at our elbow, pointing people out, saying, you know what she's does and what this. So we've got about 20 minutes or so. I'm conscious we've got people online. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Rob to come back here. I will stand by the laptop. I will use the microphone. So if people want to speak, raise a question, they can do, and I'll give you the mic. But in order to be considerate for those who are online, Rob will repeat the question, because although we will hear it in the room, they won't necessarily hear it here. There was one question online, so I'm going to give Naomi, who asked it, about 10 minutes into your talk, which was about Maria Edgeworth and Napoleon. And
Napoleon?
Yes. So she said, is it true? There are some accounts that say Napoleon read Edgeworth in exile, and just wondered if you knew anything about that. So if you come back and speak to that, and I'll get the microphone.
Right. And can I just say that I am rubbish at summarizing questions. So when I try to do it, people say, that's not what I asked you. So please feel free to butt in if I am not summarizing you accurately. To my knowledge, I thought you were going to say Maria Edgeworth was with Napoleon, or not to my knowledge. But he certainly read voluminously on St. Helena. I don't know how people say it, St. Helena, St. Helena. When he was sent into exile. And I don't think we know, is it Naomi? I don't know for certain that he did read Edgeworth. Naomi, I'm looking at you. I'm sorry, I can't say perhaps with absolute certainty, but he read voluminously, and we know he read English novels, and we know he had many English visitors, and we also know that Edgeworth, as a female novelist, was among the most popular, or the most popular, female novelists of the Regency. So it seems to me I can easily believe that he read her, but I'm sorry, Naomi, I don't know definitively if he did or not. And I've learned that you don't, I don't know. I think he probably did, but I don't know.
And Napoleon read. He was slight digression, but he was notorious for being in his coach, reading and tearing pages out of books and throwing them out as he read them. So
he's a voluminous reader, voluminous reader. And photographs as well. Yeah. So would he have read? Someone had quite an interest in the English. particularly after they banished him to. So yes, I think it's more than probable.
I see a hand up at the back.
Hi, Jane.
You've got the evidence of female networks, literary networks, intellectual networks of women in the Regency.
Repeat the question.
Oh, right. See, I've already forgotten to repeat the question. So the question is, do I have any knowledge of, I talked about individual women. Do I have any knowledge of female networks, female societies, female connections between females? And I don't want to develop a theme here, but no, I don't know of any, society of literary women. In fact, Jane, I would say that one of the things that came across, like when you study Austen, is, she got lots of support from Cassandra and from her family circle, but it just wasn't, the first 3 novels are by a lady. I didn't come across anything that made me think, oh, here is like maybe what we call the professionalization of a female writer or women banding together in any way. Now, that's not to say that, Felicia Hemans published in Blackwood's magazine and was sort of recognized as a member of that. But I think we're further down the 19th century. It's a time, of course, when there are lots of literary coteries for men. But I would like to think I would have noticed, and I don't think. Yeah, when I talk about Byron, you can say, well, he knew Thomas Moore and he, visited Leigh Hunt in prison, all this thing. When you talk about women, the world for them was just constructed in a way that was much, as of course much tighter. And so sometimes they are a part, like Felicia Hemans in Blackwood's magazine, or even in the 1820s when Letitia Land was writing for the New Monthly magazine. But at the beginning of the Regency, in the early years of the Regency, not that I know of. Do you know of something? Yeah.
Gathering in groups.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, the one thing that does occur to me is that Hannah More had a kind of salon near here in Barleywood, and people like Sarah Siddons would come to visit. And so, De Quincey attended a couple of these things, and he found it very oppressive because there was a lot of intellectual women there. But, Hannah More and her 5 sisters and Sarah Siddons and John Philip Kemble people. So I suppose there were gatherings of, but nothing very well organized. That's an excellent point. Maybe print culture ends up isolating people or isolating women rather than bringing them together. Yeah, I'm not sure.
That's an interesting talk. I wanted to just talk about the mulatto girl in Sanditon.
Okay.
At that time, there were, in the East, in India and the West Indies, there were so few women that a lot of the men married local women.
Women, yeah.
And I know it wasn't a terrible thing, because it was much later when Macaulay decided that it was wrong for the British or the Europeans to actually associate with local women.
Yes.
That he brought in that kind of a law, and if you happen to marry a local woman, you wouldn't get a job, your children wouldn't get a job. So before that time, it was quite done.
Yes.
And it was quite accepted for men to marry local women. And if they were high-class women, it made no difference. It really wasn't a class, it wasn't a stigma.
Yes. And I think that, the reaction of the people in Sanditon makes that very, very clear, that this is not out of the ordinary, astonishing, or another world. Yes. Well, if I can just say about Canada, when the French came and they married Indigenous women, there were Métis they're called known as Métis children, and it was absolutely fine. And it was, it's later that people say, hang on a minute, I don't know if that's all right or not. After it's been perfectly fine for 200 years, then someone decides it's not a good thing, and all hell breaks loose and suffering starts. But I think the reaction of the people in the novel, whether they're like quite well heeled or otherwise, demonstrates that. And to me, it's always sort of a bracing moment when you go, "Oh my God, all our constructions of history are just out to lunch." We go, "Oh my goodness, what's happening?" Whereas if history was working the way we would wish it would work, we would say just what you've said. Well, this was perfectly ordinary. Yes, there is. Yeah. In the Regency, yes, the Vanity Fair is set. Well, not all of it, but a good portion of it is set in the Regency, and there is a mulatto heiress, and so we shouldn't be surprised. And here we are. And as fine a critic as Margaret Drabble is, I have to comment on the astonishing. Nobody seems astonished. Well, that means we've got constructions of history that are not preparing us. What year is that?
I think.
Right. That you. Right.
School or be allowed in the army or anything like that. So
right.
He set the rule.
Right. Thank you.
Any other battery's going? Any other questions? I have a question about politics. Okay.
Sure, of course you can.
And perhaps the answer to this is all about how you define politics. Were these women political in any way? I mean, you talk in when you're talking about Austen about the apparently quite progressive views of some of the protagonists there, albeit within a very restricted social milieu.
Yeah.
Are any of the other women that you talked about, are they talking about themselves or about women in a way that we recognise as political? I repeat the question.
Oh, right. Ian's question was about politics, and he wondered if any of the women that I mentioned talked about or politics or acted in a political way during the Regency. And there are political hostesses, like in Holland House, or like Lady Melbourne. There are 3 women, 4 women, 5 women who are the hostesses at the most elite club, Almack's. And they have a great deal to do with which young woman ends up with which man. Lady Caroline Lamb is married to a future prime minister and a politician. Julia Peel is married to a future politician. But so Julia Peel, one of the reasons that I put her up, I took her up with the presentation, I didn't want to be here at 9:30, but she talks to her husband an enormous amount, especially in the Regency, about Ireland and what's happening in Ireland and the colonial sort of, we've got to calm it down, which means we've got to execute more Irish people. She talks at length about it. So she is I would say she's a political figure, but in a private sphere. And I would say the women at Almack's are very certain about who needs to be with whom and how marriages should work. But they are not writing political articles in the newspaper or campaigning actively, speaking a political rhetoric. I would say Austen is, I think putting Ms. Lamb in the novel is a political statement. But one of the things that that I kept bumping into as I went through are the number of ways. The further down the social scale you were as a woman, the more freedom you had. As soon as you've got some money attached to you, you've got all kinds of problems, because then you have to remain chaste. If you lose that reputation for purity, you're in real trouble on the marriage market. And Anne Elliot, for example, is only 27 years old, but she's already sort of given up and been forced onto the shelf by younger women like the Musgrove, Henrietta and Louisa Musgrove. So over and over again, I would love to have found, and I looked pretty hard to find women speaking in the way that you're suggesting, Ian. And I wasn't successful. And I looked pretty hard because that's what, that's what you want to think of women as active. And so I ended up thinking, well, leaving Britain like Lady Hester Stanhope does, in a way that that's what they can do. They're not allowed. So Austen's got to publish by a lady because you're just not allowed to enter the public sphere as a woman. But she wants to shape it. And so she takes what's available to her. And I think, standing up to Lady Catherine, a protest and insurrection, I definitely read that as a political statement. It's just not in the political language like you're suggesting.
Julia, I think there's no battery in here.
I could speak loudly. Just I think it's a way of reading Frankenstein.
Yes. It's just before Frankenstein is 1818 completed, but there are plenty of, there's the Spa Field riots, and there's lots of political dissent. Britain explodes when Wellington wins Waterloo, and 1816 is pretty positive, but by 1817 there are economic distresses everywhere. So yes, so Frankenstein is a year before Peterloo, but very much caught up in that historical moment for sure. Yes, I do. Yeah, Frankenstein is about mistreating. Yeah, Frankenstein is about being a deadbeat dad and having, well, it's one thing it's about, and bringing something into the world and not caring for it. And if you bring something into the world and you don't care for it, odds are it's going to get angry. Or if you have people and you don't care for them, odds are there's going to be anger, and anger leads to violence. And so, yes, I do. That's one of the reasons that I say the novel constantly renews itself. Because it's about cycles and doubles over and over and over again. Yeah, thank you very much.
Any more questions? Okay, in which case I will draw things to an end, and thank you all for your time this evening, and thank our speaker. But just before we applaud him, two points of information. The first is that in approximately 4 or so weeks' time, we will gather again here, April the 11th, and we will have jumped a century or so, and we'll be considering T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Sue Boyle will be talking about that. And the other thing is that if you do want to be added to our email list, please leave us your email address here before you leave. But before we stand up, if we could first put our hands together to thank Robert Morrison.